the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand. Four of the most powerful, most well-resourced intelligence-backed governments on the planet looked at the same country, ran the same analysis, and within days of each other issued the same verdict. Stay away. And the world looked at those warnings, looked at South Africa, and said, no thank you. We are going anyway. International arrivals are up 17.9%. Hotels are full. Tour operators are booked out. The warnings are being read and ignored on a massive scale. Now you have to ask yourself, what kind of country produces that reaction? What kind of place makes millions of people read an official government safety alert, acknowledge the risk, and still pack their bags? Because that tension between genuine danger and irresistible magnetism is not the whole story. It is just the surface of one. Underneath it is something far more interesting. A geopolitical battle, a racial land dispute, a pressure campaign from Washington built on claims so thoroughly debunked that even the people it claims to protect have publicly rejected them. And 4 travel warnings dropping at the most politically loaded moment in South Africa's recent history. I am going to connect all of it for you right now. Let us set the scene first. By late March 2026, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and New Zealand had all issued Level 2 travel advisories for South Africa. In the language of government travel warnings, Level 2 means exercise increased caution, not a ban, not a do not travel order, but a formal, on-the-record signal from a government to its citizens that the risk environment has shifted enough to demand heightened awareness. When one country issues that, it is routine. When 4 issue it simultaneously right before peak travel season, that is a coordinated alarm. So what are they actually alarmed about? The American advisory reads like a threat assessment briefing. Violent crime is described as common across the country. The specific crimes listed are robbery, rape, carjacking, and mugging. Smash and grab attacks on vehicles are flagged as a widespread and documented hazard. Kidnapping is listed as a direct threat to foreign nationals, with criminals specifically targeting Americans, forcing victims to withdraw cash or hand over online banking passwords before releasing them. And then comes the detail that most people gloss over, but absolutely should not. The advisory states that U.S. government employees working inside South Africa must travel in fully armored vehicles when visiting certain areas, with movement restricted to between 10 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon on weekdays only. Read that again. The American government is not warning gap year students or first-time travelers. It is telling its own diplomats, the people paid and trained to operate in difficult environments, that they need armored transport and time-restricted movement windows just to do their jobs. That is the reality on the ground in parts of South Africa right now. Canada matched that energy and then added to it. Its advisory warns of a significant level of serious crime occurring frequently throughout the country, with foreigners specifically among those affected. Major city centers, townships, and isolated areas are all flagged, especially after dark. And Canada went one step further than the others, adding a health alert to its 2026 advisory, flagging a localized diphtheria outbreak and malaria risks in the Kruger region, urging travelers to get their boosters sorted before departure. Between all 4 advisories, the list of concerns covers violent crime, robbery, carjacking, kidnapping, cybercrime, confidence scams, fake visa agents, and civil disturbances. The message is consistent, and it is serious, and the tourists are absolutely not listening. In 2025, South Africa recorded approximately 10.5 million international visitors, surpassing pre-pandemic levels and hitting a record recovery trajectory. Nearly 2 million people are employed directly or indirectly by the tourism and travel sector. Cape Town, Durban, and Johannesburg are running hotel occupancy and visitor spending at or above pre-pandemic highs. And right now, with 4 government warnings active and circulating, arrivals are still climbing at nearly 18% above last year. One garden route tour operator summed it up perfectly. There is nowhere else on Earth like South Africa. Visitors are told not to walk at night, not to flash their phones, not to be a hero, and they come anyway. The South African tourism industry understands exactly what is at stake. Safety perception can make or break a destination's recovery momentum. So industry groups are deploying targeted safety messaging, partnering with private security firms, implementing secure hotel parking, running vetted airport transfer services, and introducing dedicated tourism safety patrols across popular areas. Some destinations are setting up centralized visitor hotlines with multilingual emergency information. The infrastructure of managed risk is being built in real time, because that is what South Africa has become for the international traveler. Not a danger to avoid, a risk to manage. And for millions of people every year, a risk worth taking. But here's where the travel story ends and the real story begins. Because these 4 advisories did not drop in a vacuum. They landed in the middle of one of the most explosive geopolitical standoffs South Africa has faced since the end of apartheid. And to understand why that matters, you need to go back to January 23rd, 2025, the day President Cyril Ramaphosa signed the Expropriation Act into law. The South African government's case for the law is straightforward and backed by data. White South Africans make up 7% of the population. They still own more than 70% of the country's privately held land more than 30 years after apartheid ended. The act allows government to expropriate unused or abandoned land in the public interest, with compensation in the vast majority of cases, and without it only under specific and exceptional circumstances. That is the law as written, a targeted policy response to one of the most extreme racial wealth gaps anywhere on the planet. Now here is how Donald Trump described it. On January 20th, 2025, his first day back in the White House, Trump signed an executive order shutting down all refugee admissions globally, with one exception: white South Africans. He described them as victims of systemic racial discrimination and fast-tracked their resettlement into the United States. Within days, he followed that with a second executive order cutting all foreign aid to South Africa, accusing the government of race-based persecution of its white minority. The same administration that had just dismantled its own diversity programs, stripped funding from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and voted against a United Nations resolution acknowledging the transatlantic slave trade, declared that a black majority government trying to redistribute stolen land was the racial injustice that demanded an immediate American response. The sheer scale of that contradiction is difficult to overstate. Trump went further. He publicly repeated claims of white genocide in South Africa and an ongoing extermination of Afrikaners. Not fringe internet claims. Presidential statements, repeated from the Oval Office. And here's the thing about those claims. They were not just rejected by the South African government. They were publicly rejected by the Afrikaners themselves. The CEO of AfriForum, one of the most powerful Afrikaner rights organizations in South Africa, stated explicitly that they do not want to leave, that they did not accuse the government of large-scale race-based land seizures, and that they did not spread such narratives. The people Trump claimed to be rescuing publicly said they did not ask to be rescued, and that the picture being painted of their lives was false. Trump said none of that in his face-to-face meeting with Ramaphosa in the Oval Office. Instead, he told the South African president directly that white farmers were being killed and that nothing was being done about it. Ramaphosa's response was one of the most quietly devastating moments in recent diplomatic history. He gestured to 3 wealthy white South Africans sitting in the room and said simply that if there was an Afrikaner genocide, those men would not be there. Analysts describe the exchange not as diplomacy, but is theater staged entirely for Trump's domestic audience. What followed confirmed that reading. In March 2025, Secretary of State Marco Rubio expelled South Africa's ambassador to the United States for criticizing Trump's campaign and policies. In May, 59 white South Africans landed at Dulles Airport in Virginia as the first wave of what Trump called an Afrikaner resettlement program. In November, Trump announced that no American officials would attend the G20 summit being hosted by South Africa, calling it a total disgrace and suggesting the country should be removed from the G20 entirely. The Americans stayed home. And then Trump announced that when the United States hosts the 2026 G20 in Miami, South Africa will not receive an invitation. Add to that a proposed 30% tariff on South African goods, and a signal that the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a critical trade framework for the continent, will not be renewed. Count what that is. In 14 months, aid cut, ambassador expelled, citizens declared refugees under false pretenses, G20 summit boycotted, trade access threatened, future G20 exclusion announced. That is not a diplomatic disagreement. That is a systematic, multi-front economic and political assault on a sovereign African nation, justified by a narrative that has been publicly demolished by the very people it claims to champion. Now ask the question again. 4 governments issue coordinated travel warnings for South Africa at the same time all of this is happening. Is that a coincidence? The honest answer is we cannot prove it is not. The crime in South Africa is real. The carjackings are documented. The kidnapping threat is genuine. Nobody fabricated those statistics. But context shapes perception. And the context here is impossible to ignore. When political pressure and safety messaging arrive simultaneously from the same group of aligned Western governments, the timing asks to be questioned, even if the underlying data is legitimate. South Africa's government knows exactly what the real stakes are. Ramaphosa has said plainly that his country will not be bullied. His land reform minister challenged Trump publicly to name a single farm that had been seized from a single white farmer. No name came, but the pressure kept coming anyway, because the facts were never really the point. What South Africa is watching most anxiously is not the rhetoric, it is the economics. American companies operating in South Africa employ large numbers of workers. If the African Growth and Opportunity Act collapses and tariffs hit 30%, those jobs start disappearing. In a country where unemployment already sits above 32%, there is no cushion for that kind of blow. Ramaphosa is threading an extraordinarily difficult needle, defending his country's sovereignty and its right to set its own domestic policy, while protecting the trade relationships and employment figures that millions of South Africans depend on to survive. And through all of it, the tourists keep arriving. That fact matters more than it might seem. It means South Africa's pull on the world's imagination has not been broken by any of this. Not by the warnings, not by the political pressure, not by the headlines. The country is complicated, contested, genuinely dangerous in places, and completely irreplaceable in others. And the world apparently knows the difference. What is not acceptable is the framework being used to apply this pressure. The Trump administration is not engaging with South Africa as a partner. It is using South Africa as a prop, a politically convenient symbol deployed to signal to a specific domestic audience that a black-led African government is the racial injustice worth fighting. A country that had the nerve to pass a land law addressing apartheid's legacy, take Israel to the International Court of Justice, and refuse to align its foreign policy with Washington's preferences is being punished for exactly that independence. And the travel warnings, whatever their individual merit, land inside that story. That is the full picture. 4 governments, 1 target, a country that will not bend, and a world that keeps showing up at the airport anyway. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to see the complete picture. Leave your take in the comments. And if you are not subscribed yet, you know what to do.